Right, today is March 12th, 2022, and the Tucson Astrologers Guild is pleased to present Mary Jo Weavers speaking about Mercury. I don't know how I got your first email. Mary Jo writes blog about, it's called Capricorn Rising. Somehow I started getting that in my inbox and found that it was always very insightful. And so I decided to invite Mary Jo to be our speaker today. I'm sure she can tell you more about herself, but she has she is a certified karmic astrologer and uses the archetypal language of astrology to help her clients. And so I'm looking very forward to hearing what you have to present about Mercury today. So put your hands together and welcome Mary Jo.
Well, thank you, Gail, and I'm delighted to connect with all of you down there in Arizona. I'm up here in Western Oregon, and it's always nice to be able to meet new astrologers, especially in different parts of the country. A little bit about my background in astrology. I became an astrologer quite late in life. It occurred when the planet Uranus was transiting the sign of Aquarius back in the late 1990s. And as it was doing that, it was moving through my intercepted Aquarius in my first house of self. And up until then, I had managed to keep astrology at arm's length my whole life. But by the time Uranus was halfway through its transit of Aquarius, something was breaking down or breaking through, as they say with Uranus. And I was in the library one day and the book didn't fall off the shelf, but my hand went right for an astrology book. And I just sat down and started reading it, and felt really compelled to look into this more closely. And so by the time Uranus was finishing its transit of Aquarius in the early 200s, I had begun my formal training as a Jungian karmic astrologer and finished my work. My study, a 3-year program, went on to do some postgraduate work and continued to connect with other astrologers that went through the same program that I did in the following years. And so I've been studying and practicing astrology ever since. And now I can't imagine life without it. It's just such a rich, multi-dimensional language and model of the world that provides so much understanding of who we are, and it provides meaning for life's experiences. So that's my background. And what I'm going to be talking today is about the planet Mercury, and the title of my presentation is Mercury, Our Information Filter to the World. And I'm going to go ahead and screen share now with my slideshow. Okay, so I think we're set to go here. So what I'm going to be doing is going through a series of slides. I've broken up my presentation in segments, and I'd like to keep it a little bit more informal. I'll be stopping at various times and asking if there's any questions or comments, and maybe Gail can help me out if there's anything in the chat that you can convey to me, and we can take a break and answer any questions. So what I'm going to be covering is, first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about Mercury and its archetypal representation and interpretation in astrology. And then I'm going to take some time to break down Mercury's expression, first by polarity, and then by quality or modality. Then we'll look at its expression and function in each of the 4 elements. And then putting it all together, we will move through each of the 12 signs. And after we finish that, I have a few thoughts, some considerations about interpreting Mercury in the horoscope that are additional things that we need to pay attention to. And then I'd like to wrap up with some of my thoughts on why I think Mercury is important and what some of its applications are in life and for us as practicing astrologers with our clients. Okay. So the planet Mercury, it's the planet in our solar system that lies closest to the sun, and it orbits between the sun and the Earth's orbit, acting as a link or an intermediary between the sun and the Earth. And we can think of it symbolically as the sun representing spirit and the earth matter. And so it provides a role of communicating or linking those two. We can think of it as an envoy for the spiritual life force coming from the sun, informing us on earth through our consciousness. And in Greek and Roman mythology, Mercury, the god, acts as an emissary between the gods and also between the gods on Mount Olympus and mortals on the earth. He travels freely between the 2 worlds, and he carries messages and information, and in so doing provides that important linking function. Mercury is also the psychopomp. He escorts mortals into the underworld upon their death. And this is analogous in modern astrology, more psychological astrology, to Mercury guiding us more inwardly and into our subconscious during Mercury retrograde periods. We read in all the stories and the myths how Mercury is associated with movement and interactions, with travel and communications, and with commerce and trade. He serves as a communication channel, informing our human experience as we connect with our immediate environment and with each other. In astrology, Mercury represents our conscious mind. And in the horoscope, it defines our information filter to the world. It describes how we take in information from our immediate environment. And then once we do so, how we process it internally. And then what we do with that information or how we act upon it. It defines our innate skills and intelligence, our logic and reasoning ability, and our adaptability and our dexterity, how flexible we are. It determines how we think. It rules our communication style, as well as our logic and reasoning abilities, our adaptability in changing circumstances, and our dexterity. And it determines our learning style. It also determines our communication style. It rules our speech and verbal abilities, and in addition to all of these particular functions, what lies within Mercury's domain is also how we interact with our peers, how we move about in our local environment, in our immediate environment. And then, of course, communications such as writing, public speaking, all come under Mercury's domain. Mercury expressed through each of the 12 signs of the zodiac represent 12 different languages, or we can think of it as 12 different learning styles, or 12 different communication styles, or 12 different ways of interacting with our environment. And the house occupied by Mercury in the horoscope shows what stimulates the mind and the areas of life where it's more active or where it has a focus. It shows where innate curiosity and communication needs are most likely to be expressed. Okay. So any questions or comments at this point before we start breaking down Mercury? Okay, I'll just keep moving along here. So let's first of all look at Mercury according to the polarity of its sign. So we know that the positive or masculine signs in astrology are assertive. Their energy is outgoing, externally directed, and active. Mercury expressed through a sign of positive polarity actively engages with its environment and with other people. It seeks opportunities outside of itself to receive and share information, thoughts, and ideas. In contrast, the negative or feminine signs are more yin as opposed to the positive yang qualities. They're more receptive. Their energy is internally directed. It's passive and receptive and attracting. So Mercury expressed through a sign of negative polarity takes in information and is first of all much more reflective. It's processing information internally before acting upon it, perhaps before speaking or communicating. And then looking at Mercury's function and expression according to its quality or modality of sign. The cardinal signs tend to be stronger than the other signs. They signify the power that brings forth new beginnings as they usher in each new season in the year. Mercury expressed through the cardinal signs is much more initiating. We describe it as being creative and active, more forceful, and certainly more spontaneous. The fixed signs provide the staying power to ground and sustain and maintain the energy that was initiated by the cardinal signs. And they correspond to the middle of the 4 seasons. Mercury, expressed through any of the fixed signs, tends to be more stabilizing, more focused, more determined, and more finishing. And then we have the mutable signs, which mark the end of a season or the end of a cycle. And they are working to pave the way to begin again, to begin a new cycle. Mercury, expressed through one of the mutable signs, tends to be more flexible and more adaptable, more changeable. They are modifying or releasing what has been transpiring or what's been going on, and they're considering options for the future, for new beginnings. And then looking at Mercury's operating through the four elements, here we find some parallels in modern psychology. The Myers-Briggs types that are used in personality classification and analysis have a lot of applications over the last decades in both education and in business management. And they were adapted from Jung's psychological types. Jung's psychological types are analogous to the four elements that we use in astrology. For example, the fire signs are analogous to Jung's psychological type he calls intuition. And I call it intuitive inspiration. Mercury expressed through the fire signs is more action-oriented, spontaneous, and willful. Its communication style tends to be more powerful and assertive. It's direct and enthusiastic. It's very, very quick. It connects intellectually with others by sharing its inspired ideas and beliefs and thoughts. And learning in a fire sign Mercury is best accomplished through activity and assertive action. In contrast, we have the earth signs, which are analogous to Jung's psychological type called sensation. So earth signs use the filter of sensation as they take in information from their environment. Mercury expressed through these signs tends to be more concrete, more practical, more materially oriented, and sensory. Their communication style tends to be more deliberate, cautious, patient, and thorough. And their intellectual connection with other people tends to be through more practical realities and material concerns. Learning for this type is best accomplished by using the five senses and kinesthetic activities that involve the body and its senses. And then we have the air signs. They are thinking in nature and they correspond to Jung's thinking psychological type. Mercury expressed through the air signs tends to be curious and intellectual, social or relational, and very communicative. Its communication style is verbally articulate. It's very versatile, socially adept or socially focused, and it can be quite objective and innovative. They connect with others intellectually by sharing thoughts and ideas. And it's interesting because for this type, ideas are important in and of themselves. They don't necessarily need to have a practical application or emotional content or meaning, for example. Their learning is best accomplished when they can gather information from many different sources, through different perspectives and different situations. And then lastly, we have the water signs. The water signs function through feelings and they correspond to Jung's psychological type of feeling. And Mercury expressed through water signs is emotional. It's sensitive and imaginatively creative. They have a very rich inner life, a very rich way of internally processing information. Their communication style tends to be empathic or sympathetic, and is often based on intuition. They can almost be like an emotional sponge, where they can take in information just by feeling what the mood is in the room or what's going on emotionally inside of another person. Their intellectual connection with others is through emotional concerns or the influence of emotions on what's happening or what's going on. Their learning is best accomplished through reflection, introspection, and utilizing creative outlets for expression. They may not be particularly verbal. And so they might show caring concern not so much through words, but through action. Or if they're artistically adept, they might express themselves through some art medium. Okay, next we're going to go ahead and look at each of the signs of the zodiac and look at Mercury's function and expression through each of those, putting together the polarity, the quality, and the elements. Before I do that, I'll just take a little pause here and check in and see if we have any questions or comments.
Somebody has raised their hand.
Gail,
Say Sandy. Sandy, yeah, go ahead.
I would like to ask what quality. I would think that the fire signs would be instinctive. Which Mercury group would you put instinct? Like, I agree that the water signs probably would be more intuitive, but would you consider that the fire signs would be more instinctive?
I would agree that yes, they would be. Again, trying to differentiate between intuition and instinct. I mean, instinct is more of a primal urge or way of taking action or interacting with the environment. And I would say, yeah, I think, that's a good word to use for the fire signs. Whereas the intuition is much more internal and reflective and emotionally driven. And so again, I think that's a good term to use for the water signs.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, let's go ahead and let's take a look first of all at the fire signs. And the first fire sign in the zodiac we have is Aries. And here I'm calling Mercury in Aries the active explorer. And Mercury in Aries sees the world through the eyes of an explorer who's always seeking new territory. They tend to be very active and physical and have a lot of confidence that they can have a personal impact in any situation. They tend to be very self-aware and independent and assertive in sharing their awareness or their interpretation of what's going on or a particular thought or idea. They can be impatient if things aren't moving as fast as they enjoy. They can become bored when life is moving too slowly. Also because they're always looking for new beginnings or for something new and exciting that triggers their interest. They tend to be a risk taker, and they seek challenges and opportunities to explore new territory or to create new beginnings. In terms of their communication style, they can be very dynamic and very fiery and very enthusiastic. They're not afraid of conflict and are willing to fight for their ideas and ideals and communicate them. They may need to curb impulsivity or being aggressive or combative when they're interacting with others. Their keen self-awareness, if taken to extreme, can become selfishness, especially if they insist on making themselves the focus of communications, or when they want to move on too quickly and don't allow time for other people to share their thoughts and ideas. Then we go to the second fire sign in the zodiac, which is Leo. And I'm calling Mercury in Leo the commanding communicator. And Mercury in Leo views the world through the eyes of an actor. And for them, all of the world is a stage for them to dramatically perform their life. They seek opportunities to be center stage, the center of attention, where they can receive the recognition and the accolades that they feel they deserve. They seek relationships with people that enhance their sense of dignity and pride. And when they are communicating from the heart, when they're coming from the heart, they are very generous and fun-loving, and they can really share the enthusiasm that they have for life with others. So in terms of their communication style, they can come across as being a wonderful, courageous, charismatic communicator. Their speech has a very exuberant, self-assured, commanding flair that at times, if taken too far, can become overbearing. Mercury in Leo sometimes needs to guard against melodrama when it's communicating, and it needs to guard against role playing when it interacts with others. The self-respect that is so important to Mercury in Leo is gained by being a heart-centered, inspired, encouraging presence for others. And then the third fire sign of the zodiac is Sagittarius, and I call Mercury in Sagittarius the philosophic optimist. Mercury in Sag perceives the world through the eyes of a philosopher, and it loves to find the meaning in life. It's a freedom-loving traveler that explores the greater world of knowledge through the opportunities and experiences that it encounters in its travels. And the travels don't necessarily need to be of the physical kind. They can travel in terms of their learning or explore the world in other ways. Their information, excuse me, filter to the world is optimistic, it's spiritual, and it's full of faith in the future. They're very future oriented. They tend to see the bigger picture and the greater context of things. So we would say that they're interested in the forest rather than the trees. They might skip over the details. They really want to engage with the big picture and communicate about the big picture. They're a seeker of truth and greater meaning in life, and they love to communicate their idealistic, optimistic vision of life through teaching others. They inspire others to expand and uplift their own understanding of the greater world. I think their ultimate goal is to find themselves uplifted by connecting to something bigger and greater and vaster than themselves. Their speech tends to be straightforward, direct, and honest. And taken to extreme, it can become tactless, or inflated or self-righteous, standing on the soapbox, a sort of preachiness. It's Mercury in Sag tends to love the outdoors and the natural world. And so it finds a lot of connection through engaging with the natural world, either being involved with environmental causes or hunting and fishing, those sorts of activities. Okay, before we move on to the next category of element, any comments or questions about Mercury in the fire signs?
I'm not seeing any right now.
All right. Well, let's move on into the earth signs then. And in the earth signs, the first one that we come across in the zodiac is Taurus. And Mercury in Taurus, I call the deliberate thinker. Mercury in Taurus perceives the world through its physical senses. And it loves and values the sensory connection and the ability to find comfort and security in the world through its senses. It's the quintessential gardener. It tends the seeds it plants in life with care and dependability. It's being a fixed sign, it's very patient, it's determined, reliable. It finishes any projects that it starts. And it enjoys creating artistic objects, not only that are beautiful, but that are useful, and especially if they can employ natural materials that come from the earth. I'm thinking of things like using clay in pottery or using natural fibers in weaving. They can be resistant to change. Being a fixed sign, they're sometimes called stubborn. They can be resistant or slow to adopt new or different ideas. They communicate in a very grounded, deliberate manner. And so they come across as being emotionally very stable, serene and calm. And when they share their thoughts and ideas, they do so in a way that comes across as being very practical and very sensible. They speak from a warm, affectionate heart, usually using few words. They do excel in the arts in communication. They make wonderful musicians or singers. They love communicating through sculpture, painting, the culinary arts, or using scent, like in aromatherapy or perhaps massage. The next earth sign is Virgo, and Mercury in Virgo is the practical analyst. It views the world through the eyes of an efficient organizer, dedicated to solving problems and fixing whatever it sees as being broken. It sees the world as a place that needs structure, order, and improvement. It's known for being a perfectionist. There's always room for improvement. It maintains high standards for its own personal health and work habits so it can be of better service in the world. And it not only strives to perfect its own competency and capabilities, but it mentors others to do the same. It communicates with logic and methodological efficiency. It's very much an analytical, precise sort of speaker. It's very careful and discerning when it talks and needs to be very clear and make sure that people understand exactly what it's saying. Its studious, systematic mind is very well suited in the sciences, especially in medicine. And so this is where an area where we might find Mercury and Virgo really excelling. It pays close attention to detail. It uses discrimination and analysis to categorize details, bits or bytes of information, and to assimilate them and put them back into a cohesive whole. It can come across as being hypercritical or as a worried, anxious communicator. And then the third Earth sign is Capricorn, and Mercury in Capricorn I call the responsible communicator. Mercury in Capricorn is very pragmatic and very serious and takes life and life matters very seriously. It believes practical wisdom is gained through real world experiences. It views the world in a hierarchical fashion. So like the goat climbing the mountain peak, it feels that self-discipline and hard work are necessary to climb the ladder of life, to achieve your goals, and to earn an honorable reputation in the world. It's reserved, responsible, and very realistic in word and deed. It thinks long and hard before speaking, and its very structured mind puts limits on out of bounds or unconventional thoughts or ideas. It wants to test and condense and crystallize ideas. It modulates its speech with wisdom and maturity. Its language tends to be succinct and to the point, very economical. And it can appear to be rigid or stiff or cold and insensitive, especially if it becomes too materialistic. Okay, any questions or comments about Mercury in the earth signs?
I don't see anybody. Unclick your or raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask a question. I don't see any. I had one comment. I was thinking,
Yeah.
When you were talking about the Mercury and Taurus, the caveat is always depending on how it's aspected. I know a person who has Mercury and Taurus trine Mars in Virgo, and you can't get them to stop talking about what.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. My personal experience with Mercury and Taurus is one of my children, and with her, fortunately, when she was still quite young, I was becoming an astrologer, so I could appreciate what I needed to do. But she was very resistant to any changes in the daily schedule or anything going on in terms of after school activities. So I learned she needed time to sit and be more deliberate with it, So what I would do is a week or two before something was going to come up on the calendar, I would just drop a little hint and not say too much, but just say, oh, we're going to have to talk to this teacher about this, or we're going to have to think about that. And of course, she would take it in and I could see the heels digging in. but I would
Mhm.
just leave it and then revisit it again a few days later. And by the time the 2 weeks or whatever were up and we had to act, by then she had had enough time and it was much easier to deal with her.
Mm.
But that was, it was a good personal learning for me and how to adapt my communication style to someone else's.
That's an excellent example of why you'd want to have a chart done for your children or your grandchildren to know that kind of information. Frank, did you
Absolutely.
have a question? I see you unmuted yourself.
Oh, well, I was just going to throw in another little story like Mary Jo was talking personally. I don't want to go on and on with everybody, turn this into a forum for everybody talking about their own charts, but this kind of hits the point. My Mercury is in Cancer, but it's conjunct my Uranus, which is also in Cancer. And this tends to fire up with a Aquarian energy, my communication style. The conjunction is also sextile my Saturn in Virgo, and the degree of the Saturn is right in between the Uranus and the Mercury. So you would think that Saturn would kind of settle things down. And I think it does in terms of age. We've talked about how different traits of a person's planet will change as they age. When I was a lot younger, I was notorious for, like you said a minute ago, somebody that you just can't shut up. Well, it wasn't that I talked that much, but I talked in great detail and over-explained. And somebody, I think actually it was Lisa Howells, who's here today, that I had known from a yoga meditation group 20 years ago. We were talking astrology, and she said, "Oh yeah, that's why you do it. You got Uranus closely conjunct your Mercury, so you talk like that." But also Saturn is in Virgo, and that wants to be detailed and wants a complete explanation. My brother-in-law once said that you ask Frank what time it is, and he'll explain to you how a watch works. Okay, so I've used up enough time, but it's kind of a nice little tutorial about how Mercury in Cancer isn't quite functioning. With the things that you listed on your slide of Mercury in Cancer, because it's got these other aspects. Okay, now that I've explained that long thing, I'll turn the mic over to somebody else.
Thanks, Frank. Okay, kind of led you into the next
Yes.
element.
Well, thank you for sharing, Frank. I will be towards the end of my talk talking about some of those special considerations that you just outlined so well. So we'll get to some of those things. Okay, so let's see here. Oh. How come my cursor doesn't want to work? There we go. Okay. So moving into the air signs. The first air sign in the zodiac is Gemini. And I'm calling Mercury in Gemini the information gatherer. And the image that I use is that Mercury in Gemini sees life as a library filled with new ideas and thoughts and experiences to satisfy its curiosity. It's an avid information gatherer and loves to read and write. Its intelligence, it tends to be quite clever and can quickly grasp new ideas, different perspectives. It's very versatile and adapts to changing conditions and responds to differing opinions with open-mindedness and flexibility. It has an uncanny ability to be able to hold polar opposite ideas or perspectives and in its mind at the same time. It can more easily look at a situation or an idea from different perspectives, all at the same time. It's very social and tends to love talking and readily sharing information with others. It communicates with liveliness and movement, often using its hands to speak. And it tends to be more ambidextrous, or it can multitask. It can keep a lot of balls in the air at the same time. Or it can be talking on the phone while it's checking its email or Twitter feed at the same time. When it's not focused, it can be easily distracted and appear to be scattered or inconsistent. It's interested in details. And so in contrast to Mercury and Sag, Mercury and Gemini is more interested in the trees than the forest. And then the second air sign is Libra. And I call Mercury in Libra the refined negotiator. Mercury in Libra seeks beauty, refinement, peace, and harmony in the world. It seeks out social relationships and partnerships where a meeting of the minds can be nurtured and fostered. It values cooperation and collaboration, diplomacy and teamwork. It's a very skilled negotiator. It strives for balance, fairness, and justice for everyone in a situation. It communicates with kindness and courtesy, and it's very gracious, and because it wants to please others. It really does appreciate both sides of an argument and endeavors to find the middle ground in all conflicts. However, when taken to an extreme, this can be a detriment for itself, because when it wants peace at any price, it can compromise itself when it puts the wants and needs or ideas of others before its own. It can be indecisive or vacillating in order to avoid anger. It can be seen as a fence sitter who doesn't want to make a decision. And then the third air sign is Aquarius. And here I call Mercury in Aquarius the innovative thinker. It perceives the world through the eyes of an innovative reformer who wants to break through old conventions that keep humankind caught in the past and prevent humankind from moving into the future. Its mind is very logical and very rational, and it has the ability to detach from emotionality in order to observe objectively. And then when it does so, it has very keen insight and even unconventional ways of thinking about things. It has an ability to look at something and make connections between different aspects of something or different parts of a problem, and make connections or see patterns that aren't obvious to the rest of us. It invents new ways to use science and technology to solve problems and to help humanity move into the future. It's a friendly social sign. So it comes across as a very friendly, progressive communicator who has lots of interesting ideas. It's a skilled networker and knows how to work with other people who share its visions and causes. Its speech is very rational It speaks philosophically about its ideals about the future. It's an altruistic lover of humankind. However, it can have difficulty in close relationships, in one-on-one relationships, where it can be seen as being too detached or perhaps too cold or too remote. It values independent thought and equality. And at its best, it's a wonderful altruistic humanitarian. Any thoughts or insights about the air signs, Mercury and the air signs?
May I just make a comment?
Yeah.
Steve Jobs comes to mind because he has that Mercury in Aquarius, and he was considered a great communicator. But it was in Mercury retrograde of all things. So I was wondering if you had any comment about that.
Yes, I will be talking about Mercury retrograde in a few minutes here. Yes, but he is a wonderful example, and I didn't realize his Mercury was retrograde, but that does make a lot of sense. Yes, I think Thomas Edison also was another inventor who has, excuse me, who had Mercury in Aquarius, or at least more than one or two personal planets in Aquarius. Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and move into the water signs, and I'm going to have some water. So the first water sign in the zodiac is Cancer, who I call the sensitive listener. And Mercury in Cancer perceives the world through its feelings. And emotions tend to color all of its perceptions, all of its processing of thoughts and ideas. It tends to have a rich, imaginative inner life. And its highly developed sensitivity and empathy enable it to merge with the emotions of others. So they're going to be very sensitive to other people who perhaps are feeling moody or not feeling particularly energetic about something. The emotions from past memories with Mercury in Cancer are easily retained, and they can be very easily triggered by current circumstances or experiences. It's almost as if, if somebody looks at you a certain way in the grocery store, and then all of a sudden there's something about that triggers within the Mercury in Cancer, that's the way their father used to look at them when they were 3 years old, then those feelings or emotions of the 3-year-old are brought up into the present moment there in the grocery store. They are a very sensitive listener, and they pay closer attention to the emotional content of what is being said rather than the words themselves. Their speech tends to be very caring and calm and maternal. And that's because their natural inclination or urge is to protect, to support and nurture, because they need security in the world, and they want to be able to provide that same sort of safety or security for others if they perceive it being needed. Because of its gentle vulnerability, Mercury in Cancer can feel a need to close down emotionally for protection, almost like the hermit crab pulling into its shell. And this can make communication difficult, and they may not be very verbal. So again, this was an example I think I used earlier, where it's don't listen to what they're saying or what they're not saying, but instead pay attention to how they're acting or responding through gestures, through other ways that they feel that they're providing comfort or connection. The next water sign of the zodiac is Scorpio. And here I call Mercury in Scorpio the powerful investigator. And Mercury in Scorpio views the world through the eyes of an emotional investigator, seeking to understand the darker side of the human psyche. It probes the depths of our inner self with passionate intensity, and it's attuned to the transformational potential in what it's perceiving. It's very determined, powerful, relentless, and can become extreme. It sees the world as an exciting, intriguing, mysterious, and somewhat dangerous place. In terms of its communication style, it can be quite forceful, even confrontational. And it can tend to communicate sort of an all or nothing attitude in its thoughts and ideas. It can be very secretive and inscrutable. Sometimes it's hard to really know what a Mercury in Scorpio is thinking. That Scorpio nature wants to keep parts of itself hidden, or it doesn't want to fully divulge itself. Its speech can be intimidating or frightening to others who are less intense. And when self-controlled and resourceful, it can be an ingenious agent for evolutionary change and personal transformation. And the last water sign is Pisces, the last sign of the zodiac. Here I call Mercury in Pisces the compassionate communicator. Mercury in Pisces views the world through the eyes of a sensitive, spiritual romantic. It's very receptive and reflective, empathetic and compassionate, and it's very much tuned into emotional pain and suffering in the world, as well as in one-on-one relationships or connections. It seeks creative outlets for its imaginative and even mystical inner visions. So some of our most wonderful artists have Mercury in Pisces. It sometimes has difficulty dealing with the real world and harsh realities, and it seeks escape or time alone. So Mercury in Pisces can often benefit by going on retreats or spending some time in a monastery, or just, getting away from the busyness of the world. That can be just too much or too overly stimulating. It communicates gently, expressing ideas and thoughts carefully. It's very impressionable and intuitive, picking up on the emotional energy of others. So again, we have another Mercury style that is almost like a sponge that's able to walk into a room and tap into the emotional charge or what's going on emotionally with other people. It needs to learn to create healthy boundaries for itself because of its ability to merge almost effortlessly sometimes with other people in situations. It needs to learn how to create this boundary, that this is my stuff, this is your stuff, in order to protect itself. It speaks of its transcendent understanding of the world and the spiritual nature and meaning of experiences. It expresses itself lyrically through poetry, music, and all forms of art. Okay. Any other comments or questions about Mercury in the water or any of the other signs?
I'm not seeing anybody right now.
Okay.
Very thorough.
Sounds good. So I think Frank mentioned a couple good additional considerations. Having said all of this and having marched through all of the 12 signs of the zodiac, I have some other considerations I wanted to discuss. And the first one, I think it was Tom who mentioned Steve Jobs having his Mercury retrograde in his natal chart. We know as astrologers that there are other factors and elements in the horoscope that influence the expression of any particular planet, including Mercury. And so one here is if Mercury is retrograde in the natal chart, and that affects about 18% of the population. And that guesstimate came about by calculating if 3 weeks, 3 times a year, Mercury is moving retrograde, and if there's an equal probability of people being born on each day of the calendar year, then we would have 18% of people being born during those 3 weeks, 3 times a year, and that comes out to 18% of the population. So when we think about when planets are moving retrograde, they are backing up and changing direction. And so what we see represented in the mythology and the myths around Mercury is it's maybe taking us into more deeper layers of our consciousness. Mercury retrograde is a time for us to slow down, to maybe pay more attention internally rather than being so engaged in the outer world. That's the kind of advice we give our clients if they're having difficulty during a Mercury retrograde. And so for people who are born with Mercury retrograde, it's almost as if perhaps they're wired in some way that Mercury's function and expression is more internal. They may be spending more time processing internally, or they may be having more conversations with themselves, or they might be accessing different parts of the mind to make connections or to find meaning. They might reconsider more before speaking. And oftentimes I've had a few clients that feel like they're often misunderstood. And I have one lovely client with her natal Mercury retrograde in the 12th house who says she feels off all the rest of the year. She only feels good when Mercury is moving retrograde. She feels like she's operating in a more natural, authentic way during her Mercury retrograde periods. Now, there's various thoughts about why Mercury functions the way it does when it's retrograde and when it's retrograde in the natal chart. According to some astrologers, the power of retrograde planets, any of the planets when retrograde, is intensified because a retrograde planet is closer to the Earth in its orbit around the sun when it is retrograde. And so perhaps in terms of Mercury, when Mercury is retrograde, the mind can be more powerfully stimulated. And there's a greater need to direct the function of Mercury internally. Joanne Wickenberg, in her book, Your Hidden Powers, has an interesting discussion about Mercury retrograde. She says any retrograde planet represents a function of personality operating against the normal tide of social trends. And so she describes how people with natal Mercury retrograde might have difficulty expressing feelings, of not fitting in with the conventional ways of thinking about things. There may be confusion or feelings of inadequacy or just plain old frustration, and that they need time and space to sort, analyze, and process and digest information internally. And because they're doing it in perhaps a somewhat unconventional way, that they may come up with unique perceptions or a unique way of understanding the material that they're processing, or have new and different insights or interpretations or applications. And, you know, then again, your example of Steve Jobs, he's a very good example of that. Who would have thought, you know, we'd have iPads and all these things? That was certainly a different way of coming up with new ideas. Let's see here.
It might be interesting to see who is here today that has Mercury retrograde.
Yeah. Who here has natal Mercury retrograde?
I do.
Ah, so can you share about that?
Tracy Corbin says she does too. Yes, I have Mercury retrograde in Scorpio. And I'm not, you know, and supposedly you're not supposed to suffer when Mercury goes retrograde so much, but I find wherever it's going retrograde, I still have problems with it. But I was just thinking about the Mercury retrograde process, and it has the shadow zone that it's in before it actually goes retrograde, and then the shadow zone that it's in as it comes back up to speed finally. When it's slow, when Mercury is really going slow, I mean, we're still feeling quite frustrated. I think I've been noticing that more than ever with this Mercury retrograde conjunct Pluto in Capricorn.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Yeah.
So do you ever, I mean, it is actually going very slowly. It takes a while to come back up to speed. And I never had given it much thought, but in your discussion about Mercury retrograde here, it made me think about that.
Yeah, I have
whether
Mercury
it's fast.
retrograde as well in Cancer in the 12th house, combust next to the sun. And but I can't say that I feel more myself when Mercury is retrograde. I mean, I feel just as confused and frustrated by all the stuff that goes wrong as anybody ever does.
Yeah. I know for me, every Mercury retrograde operates differently and I feel differently about it. So I imagine that, you know, depending on what part of your chart it's going through and what house, you know, it makes sense that it would feel differently. Or I mean, some Mercury retrogrades, I feel like I can just zip through as if they weren't even there. And other ones, I feel like I'm being brought to my knees. Yeah. Well, thank you. Another consideration for when we take a look at Mercury in the chart, in the horoscope, is if Mercury is placed in what we call an unconscious house. And again, that might be a more Jungian term. We call the water houses that are houses of emotion. Those are what we might term unconscious houses. So, for example, if Mercury is in the 4th house, then the focus of Mercury and the areas of life where it's going to be more actively engaging in have to do with family, home, early childhood experiences, emotional foundations, beginnings and endings, which is the content of that house is more emotional. Similarly, if Mercury is in the 8th house has to do with intense and significant transformational experiences and intimacy, sexuality, death and regeneration. Or the 12th house, which is so difficult to put into words, even to talk about the 12th house. It contains our unconscious or subconscious material, our hidden self, the parts of us we're not aware of, karma, suffering, and spiritual reward. So if Mercury is in a water house in the chart, Mercury will naturally be curious about exploring and needing to process and communicate in some way the material from that particular house. Right. And then we have another house that we sometimes call an unconscious house, and that's the 7th house. In Jungian terms, we call that the house of projection, because it's directly opposite our 1st house of self. And so according to Carl Jung, projection is whatever it is that we don't recognize or accept or understand in ourselves, we can project onto others. And for me, is, you know, in my practice, taking a look at the 7th house is very illuminating for people, especially if they come to me with long-term issues or problems they're trying to cope with or trying to figure out. Because that 7th house is going to contain that which we need to work on, we need to resolve, we need to own, and we need to incorporate into our, what would be our 1st house. So if Mercury is in that house of projection, then the expression of that Mercury may not be something that the individual really resonates or feels that they are aligned with. However, through their face-to-face relationships, they have opportunities to observe and see how these other people are doing, you know, their Mercury. And so they can observe it, they can learn about it. If they have any issues that they need to resolve about it, that work can be done. So then they can eventually own and express their own Mercury. Okay, another consideration is when Mercury is intercepted in the natal chart. And this happens if you're working with the Placidus house system, which is the house system that I work with, I resonate with. And so in an interception, in a house, in a chart that has intercepted signs, if Mercury is in one of the signs that is intercepted, that whole sign as well as Mercury are intercepted in the chart. And there's lots of different interpretations of this. Some astrologers say the function of that sign or its expression can be repressed, or it's cut off, or for whatever reason, it's not as easily accessible. They say that, you know, the questions that you ask are not fully or readily addressed in life, or you might have difficulty. For whatever reason, I really like Joanne Wickenberg's explanation of it. She talks about how in the house that has the interception, the sign on the cusp of the house is the door to get into that area of life. And so we tend to use that sign as our approach to deal with those issues in life. The intercepted sign that's inside of that house, if the Mercury is in there, it's almost as if it's trapped in a closet. So we have to open up another door to get into that closet to access that Mercury. And usually that happens after we've had some experience using the sign at the beginning of the cusp of the house. In my experience, I do have intercepted signs in my chart, and a lot of my clients do. To me, it just means that we have to do a little bit more work. It needs a little bit more conscious effort and a little bit more understanding. What Joanne Wickenberg talks about is, because of this extra challenge that people might have if their Mercury is intercepted in the natal chart, the knowledge that they gain or the way that they process the information is going to be uniquely their own. They've got to find their own way to access it. It's not necessarily going to be conventional or mainstream. And so their information processing and the knowledge that they gain from it is going to be unique. And so it should be recognized as such. Another consideration, I think somebody mentioned something about the time element, that as we get older, the expression of the planets can change with age. And so one important consideration, I like looking at secondary progressions. And progressed Mercury, because it is a very fast moving planet in our solar system, it can change sign or house by secondary progression. And when it does so, it provides an opportunity for us to add another layer of complexity on top of the foundational natal Mercury that we have in our chart. If it changes sign, or if it changes house, if it changes sign, then that provides another opportunity for us to experience what it's like to have a whole different information filter to the world. If it changes house, then it provides another area of life where Mercury may be focused. And then the last consideration I wanted to mention is the importance of the third house. I've been talking about Mercury this whole time, but we also need to look at the third house in the chart, because that is going to influence how we take in information and how we process it and what we do with it. So the third house represents the areas of life that correspond to archetypal Mercury. It has to do with how we interact with our local environment, how we explore it, our local environment, our side-by-side relationships, our learning, and our early life education. So the sign on the cusp of the third house, in Joanne Wickenberg's terminology, is the door that gets us into these areas of life. And it describes what stimulates the individual to enter into those areas of life. Their Mercury may be placed somewhere else in the chart, in a different sign. So it is important to look at this third house and blend that with the position and expression of Mercury in the chart. Also, if there are other planets in the third house, then again, those planets are going to have an influence on the content or the areas of life that are contained in that third house. Any questions or comments about any or all of these considerations? Maybe you have some that you've run across.
Sandy has her hand raised.
Yes, I really like the comment you made earlier about when Mercury is retrograde, we have greater access to the subconscious mind. I really, really like that. And to me, I lived through a progressed Mercury retrograde, and it was, if I didn't believe in astrology prior to that, I definitely would have gone on board, because it lasted, thank God, only for a couple of years, but it was really disconcerting, confusing. I really, really felt it. Sometimes I felt like I was walking around inside of a fishbowl. I really didn't care for the experience at all. And I think one of the great things about Mercury retrograde periods in anyone's life is whatever projects that were started some time ago, or whatever things you want to go forward with in the future, or you're considering, it is a great time to do research. So I think I try to work with those principles, and it's really, really benefited me to work with it instead of, quote, dreading it. And thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a wonderful share. Yeah, there's another astrologer up here in the Northwest by the name of Gray Crawford, and he's a Hellenistic astrologer, and he speaks and writes very eloquently. He has newsletters that he sends out, and he talks about Mercury being the psychopomp, and when Mercury is retrograde, how important it is to be able to create that space in our life so we can get into that material that maybe is uncomfortable or disconcerting or is just so different. But I love reading what he has to say about that. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, well, I'm going to finish up with one more slide here. I can get it, just, there we go. Okay, so yes, so I'd like to finish up here with a few thoughts about why I think Mercury is important and what some applications are for us as astrologers. And so certainly as astrologers, we want to be able to communicate as skillfully as possible with our clients. And I know for me, if I'm working with a new client, one of the first things I do in looking at their chart is I look at their Mercury, the sign and the placement of it, because I want to understand what their information filter to the world is. So I can speak to their listening as clearly as possible, so I can align the way I'm communicating with the way that they can receive it in the best way. You know, for example, if my Mercury is in Aries and theirs is in a sensitive water sign, I know I'm going to have to tone it down. You know, I know I'm going to have to slow down. I'm going to have to be, you know, more soft and gentle. And so, and that's, you know, that's a way that I can show respect for the client too. So again, I'm going to be thinking about how can I speak to their listening, and then also thinking about my own natal Mercury. How might my Mercury hinder, or how can it help? How does it interact or interface with their Mercury, so we can make our communication exchange as positive as and helpful as possible. Now, when we're working, when we're interacting with coworkers or families and friends, we may not be familiar with their charts. You know, we don't know what their Mercury is. However, we can think back to when we were looking at Mercury expressed through polarity, and we can see that that's analogous to, we can observe a person's more of an extrovert versus an introvert, because that's analogous to the positive and negative polarity types. Or we might be able to observe the quality or the modality of how they're speaking or acting. If they seem to be much more energetic or forceful or assertive versus being more fixed or stable or deliberate, or if they're much more adaptable and interested in a variety of ways, or if they're very changeable. So that's something we can key in on without knowing exactly what their Mercury sign and placement is. When we speak to a group, because we're going to have, a broad spectrum of Mercury types and information filters to the world out there, then we can try alternating and adopting different ways of speaking and communicating, so we can reach as many people as skillfully as possible. And then lastly, I think that it's a good practice to try to use a different communication style, or imagine what it would be like to have a different information style to the world, because that helps me gain a better understanding of where people are coming from, and an appreciation for how different we all are. And that's one of the wonderful things about astrology. So that's all I have for today. And I want to thank you for your time. And if there's any further questions or comments, I welcome them.
I think this last slide was very, could qualify you for teaching. I don't know, gives it, I really like this, this slide, what you've presented here, and how it could be so helpful for speakers of all types in reaching their audience or family members. I mean, you could teach a class just based on the Mercury to enable people to talk better. Here's from Diana. Any thoughts on Mercury conjunct the nodes?
Which node? Right. So, I mean,
either one.
Either one. Okay. Obviously, then that's going to be an important focus in the person's life. If it's the south node, then, and you are talking about the lunar nodes, I'm guessing.
Yes.
Okay. So if Mercury is conjunct the south node, then that suggests that there's some ingrained patterning that's could get in the way, or could be problematic, or could keep the person stuck if they continue to operate out of that same place. The way that I coach clients about their south node is it requires conscious awareness. The way I was trained was rather simplistic. South node, bad, good, north node, good, sort of thing. And then in studying and working with it more, I've gained a better appreciation for, if we have a lot of karmic or past life experience developing these skills in the south node, I want to be able to make use of those, and I want to bring them forward and perhaps bring them out into the rest of the chart more skillfully and apply them more towards the north node. So, Mercury conjunct the south node suggests that I want to pay attention and be conscious about how am I interacting with my local environment, with my immediate environment. Where does my mind naturally go? How do I think about things? Because it's going to be such an ingrained pattern. It's almost as if I'm doing it without even knowing that I'm doing it. And so I want to take a look at that sign that it's in, that house placement, placement and think about, am I expressing it through that sign in the highest and the best ways? And in what areas of life do I tend to get perhaps stuck in, or that I'm focused in most of the time? And in what ways can I open up and move in the direction of the North Node and use my North Node to help move me forward? If, on the other hand, if Mercury is conjunct the North Node, then that's a different situation in which, oh, this is something I really do need to work on in this lifetime, and it might feel difficult, or I don't really know how to handle it, because oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the North Node indicates an area that's new to us and very unfamiliar, or we just don't have a lot of experience for one reason or another. And so with Mercury there, it's, oh, well, I want to consciously pay more attention to how I do move about in my environment, how I take in information, how I interact with my peers. And again, work with the sign of that North Node. And of course, there's going to be all these other considerations. You know, a lot of people do have a whole bunch of planets up against their North Node. And so if they're personal planets, which Mercury is a personal planet, you might have an easier time working with it than if it's more of a transpersonal planet. Does that make any sense? Does that resonate?
Yeah, thank you.
We had a person express how much she has enjoyed your lecture. We've had several of those, in fact. Yes.
Well, thank you.
I was noticing, well, there's 3 of us that spoke up and said, yes, we had Mercury retrograde. So that, since there's 15 of us on this Zoom, I think that speaks to the percentage, right?
You're well represented, yes.
Well, about 18%, you said?
About
people had
18%,
retrograde.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And 3 out of 15 is 20%. So that's pretty close, actually, to what it would.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, let's see, what was this other chat?
Three people.
I suppose you can read the chat too, what people are saying. Tal, did you have a question? You have your hand up. Tal
Hi.
Schwartz.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you so very much for this. I've been trying to figure out what has been happening with my almost 16-year-old granddaughter. And I've been keeping a loose leaf notebook of everybody's charts that I've done in the family. And I just opened it up. And as of the last full moon, I wrote to my daughter and son-in-law, both Scorpios, both with Mercury in Scorpios. And I just looked at my granddaughter's chart and I decided that I was giving them all their wings. I no longer want to be the subject of their horrible conditional love. And this suddenly just blows me away to see that my granddaughter has her Mercury retrograde in the 7th house, ruled by Cancer.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm thinking, wow, with the mother and father where they are, and with the granddaughter like this, I don't know that there's much choice. I've trained in neurolinguistics and Oriental medicine, and had always approached my granddaughter with a mystical, because my Mercury is in Pisces in the first house. But I'm just, this is so helpful. Thank you. I need to retreat from trying to be. So thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. Yeah. When you first started talking about, the teenagers, Mercury is important, especially, for younger people, for children. It's Gemini and Mercury correspond to young people. And I think it's important, for those of us that are working either within our families or with clients that are parents, or, occasionally we will work with a child. I think Mercury is even more important than when we're working with us, seasoned older people. I've had people come to me and they want to have the charts done of their children, or a new grandchild or such. And they'll say, oh, they're a sun sign this and they're a sun sign that. But I find that I tend to try to steer them more towards looking at Mercury. Because when you think about it, a new little human being coming into life, one of the first things we do is we're interacting with our immediate environment, and we're taking in all of this information. And depending on how we're wired, I think that that's very important to know how to deal with, an infant or a small child. And then later, as they get into preschool or school, it's so important to understand what their learning style is. I mean, my son read, when he was learning how to read, he read in a totally different fashion than my daughter did. And so it was important for me to be able to understand how they were seeing the words on a page and how they were bringing it in and how they were getting the meaning out of it. Anyway, I think Mercury is important.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Let's see. Elizabeth Sure has had her hand up for a while. She had a question for you.
Yeah, I just had a couple quick questions actually. I wondered if you could speak to third house rulership in a mercurial sign. And also, do you look at whether Mercury is occidental or oriental to the sun?
I haven't, regarding your second question. And then remind me again, your first question about
the third house cusp ruler being in a mercurial sign, Virgo, Gemini. What do you think? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that there's just going to be some mutual understanding there, because, having either a Gemini or Virgo there's going to be a real understanding and a common interest between that sign and Mercury, in that third house, that the areas of life that are ruled by Mercury. So it's almost like it would be easier to get or to understand or to know what to do. I remember reading in one of Joanne Wickenberg's, I've been reading her stuff a lot for some reason this year. She was mentioning that what we learn in the third house then has application in the sixth house when we move out into the world. And so she talks about the natural affinities between the third and the sixth house, or between Gemini and Virgo, and then having the common ruler of Mercury, having that blending and having that sequencing in how it gets engaged with in our lives.
Mary
Thank
Jo, may we ask you what your Mercury is in?
Yeah, my Mercury is in Gemini, and I have a stellium in Gemini in my fifth house. So as well as Mercury, I have Venus, and then I have Jupiter in Gemini. So and in my family, my close family, my Mercury doesn't work well with either any of those. And so it's a continual lesson for me to learn how to adapt. And I feel like having my Mercury in Gemini, I kind of take on the responsibility of doing a little bit more adapting and being a little bit more flexible and trying to accommodate some of these other Mercury styles that I interface with on a regular basis.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Anybody else?
I just had a quick comment after what you were saying about the Gemini. Was reflecting back on George Carlin, who was a Gemini, married to a Gemini, and his daughter was a Gemini. So I wonder what their Mercuries were, but I can imagine the household given just his style of.
Yeah. Pretty exciting. Yeah.
Sandy, did you have another question?
Yes, I do. I wanted to, of course, my dog can sort of, but I wanted to say that I think that, you know, a lot of astrologers first go to the moon or to the sun. And I really agree that Mercury really is the foundation of relationships, for good or ill. And I think it is underappreciated in the chart. And I was delighted to see that it was highlighted in today's talk. And the other thing I want to stress is the power of the third house as far as early childhood environment and education sets up the personality for the rest of the incarnation.
Wow.
That early childhood environment, education, the mind is, you know, the brain literally is developing. And it is so important to the fulfillment and you know, how the person is going to, whether the nature and nurture is positive or negative, how it infects the entire life, especially if there's been trauma or abuse or neglect. It is amazing how that third house is important to the development of the individual.
I agree. And just a little point to add to what you've already said that I think is wonderful. Even if you have, I'll call it an empty third house, you still have the planetary ruler of the sign on the cusp.
Yes.
And you know, where that planet is in the chart and the aspects it's making are super important to take a look at. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else?
Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. Very thorough. Terrific.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you for your feedback.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much for coming on today, Mary Jo. And it's a perfect time for talking about Mercury, isn't it? With Mercury conjunct Pluto and Capricorn, we've learned some real practical ways to communicate with other people for success. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed spending this time with you today.
Right. Thank you. I think that does it. You want to?
Well, now I can see all of your wonderful chat comments.
Good. And since
Oh,
there's a
in the
few of us
recording?
still left, a few people linger, and we can just chat a little bit if you want to, but I guess you can turn off the recording, Frank, or
Okay.
I don't know, how about, so we turn the recording off, Tom. Tom's in charge, but it's fun to just not record and have a little chat afterwards for those who like to stay.
Well, can I ask about your guild? How long have you had the Tucson Astrology Guild?
Since 1979.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's so cool.
It is. My friend Margot here, met her at the Guild back in 1989 or 88, 89, 90. And she went away and traveled extensively and come back to Tucson and looked me up. And here we are, still having the Tucson Astrologers Guild.
Wow. That is wonderful. Kudos to you for, it's such a long-lived association. That's wonderful. Yeah.
We have some fixed sign in our fixed sign.
We
But
actually,
it's good to,
we
go
actually
ahead.
have a pretty good birth chart for the Astrology Guild. There's a story where the founders were saying we should have an organization of astrologers here in Tucson, and what will we name it? And they were sitting around talking, and somebody said Tucson Astrologers Guild, and everybody said, "Oh, okay, that's good." And that was 8:20 p.m. on, what was it, August 23rd, 1979, or something like that.
Mhm.
So we've used that chart. It does seem to match with how the guild has grown and changed and moved and all that sort of stuff over the years.
That's fantastic. That's wonderful that you had, the wherewithal to pay attention when somebody said that. And what an auspicious date and time. That's fantastic. Yeah.
One of our founding members couldn't be here with us this weekend, but Susie Cox has been with the guild from the beginning. I came along in 1986 when they had the Astro Players, Astro Drama. We did a lot of Astro Drama. We did the Astro Drama for the first UAC in 1986.
Oh. That's
But yeah,
great.
we really grateful for the team that keeps this outfit going. Frank, our treasurer, Tom, our tech person. Now we have Anika being in charge of the used book sales. She's, and we have all our great members like Elizabeth, Lizzie Shearer, and Diana and Margot, and like to welcome Tal as one of our new members. She just moved to Tucson and looked us up, and here she is. So yay for members, our members. They keep us going.
That's wonderful. Well, it's been delightful to be a part of your group today. And you guys have a really good feeling. I mean, yeah, I really enjoyed it. And so thank you for inviting me again, Gail. And thank you for listening to me today.
We enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I will say goodbye. Take care.